In 1968, right after Martin Luther King was assassinated, the Congress passed the Federal Fair Housing Act. And what it does is it prevents discrimination in all kinds of housing transactions, including the sale of a house, the rental of an apartment, steering by realtors, something called redlining, deciding that you're not going to give mortgages in some areas, but you will give them in others, and a whole lot of other kinds of housing practices. So it's a very broad, very important civil rights statute. And the case was brought by a group of individuals, the Inclusive Housing Project, who basically said that the way in which the state of Texas was giving out tax subsidies, essentially low-income tax credits, was discriminatory and that it violated the Fair Housing Act. We have this thing called the low-income housing tax credit, and what it does is it tries to get builders and developers, gives them some additional money to create housing for folks with lower incomes, and so they get a tax credit, right, if they do that. So it's basically a federal subsidy. One of the things the Fair Housing Act says it's not good to do, that it's a violation to do, is to segregate people. What we do is we say with the tax credits, maybe we don't want to have them all located already in black neighborhoods, which tends to mean that folks are going to live there. So that was the theory of the plaintiff's case, that if you just use all your tax subsidies in neighborhoods that are already, where people of color are already living, that has a discriminatory effect, even if that wasn't the intent on the part of the government agency or of the builder. I think everybody was surprised at the outcome in the case. It was a 5-4 decision written by Justice Kennedy. All the lower courts that had looked at the issue in terms of interpreting the statute and the language of the statute said, yeah, you can prove a violation of the Fair Housing Act, showing that the person intended to discriminate, but also based upon effect. But we had never heard from the Supreme Court, and there was just a tremendous amount of concern that they would say, give it a very narrow interpretation, but they gave it a qualified, broader interpretation. There was something called a remand in this case. What the Supreme Court did was basically say, this is the standard, right? The Fair Housing Act can be proved, or you can show a violation of the Fair Housing Act on this disparate impact theory. But now, lower courts, you go down and you figure out the facts and you worry about, you apply the standard and you sort of see what happens. On remand, that's your job. So it's not clear what's going to happen on remand. One of the things I thought was so interesting about the case was that everyone was very excited. They said, oh, this is a very broad interpretation of this federal statute. But when you actually really read the case, it's not quite as broad as it first appears. Yes, the Supreme Court does find that there's a disparate impact theory under the Fair Housing Act, but it's a little bit like the devil's in the details, because they also give a very limiting interpretation of how it's going to be applied or how lower courts should apply it on remand. And I wouldn't be surprised if, when we go back to the lower courts, applying the standard that Justice Kennedy has articulated, that we actually find that there was no violation of the Fair Housing Act in this particular case. But we're going to have to wait to see what the lower federal courts do.